Well, thanks everyone for coming, and my talk is going to focus on incident cancer risk in a PFAS exposed community. To thank my co-investigators on this project. The project will focus on a town in southern New Hampshire called Merrimack, New Hampshire. This town has a large industrial source of air emissions from a plant, Saint-Gobain Performance Plastics, that moved to New Hampshire, Merrimack, New Hampshire from Bennington, Vermont in 2002. At least one of the processes they use includes multiple coating and heating applications of PFAS containing products on glass fabrics, and they use PFAS chemicals as dispersants. We conducted this study in part due to concerns raised by the community, where they were dissatisfied with what they thought was the assessment. They had some valid concerns, we thought, so we decided to take a look at this problem. Here's a map that shows the southern area of New Hampshire. Merrimack's almost in the center of that shaded area. In 2016, the high levels of PFOA, one of the 9,200 or so PFAS chemicals we know now exist, was detected in the municipal water system in the Merrimack area. And the untreated emissions from that plant impacted the soil, groundwater, and drinking water. Now we know in 5 towns surrounding Merrimack, including Merrimack, in southern New Hampshire. The shaded area shows the area originally thought to have been impacted by the air emissions. The red, orange, and purple dots signify private well or drinking water well contamination above the current MCL in New Hampshire, the enforceable standard. As you can see now, though, over the past few years, the impacts are known to extend beyond the shaded area, and the full extent of impacts to drinking water is unknown at this point. This is a conceptual model that will help portray how this contamination happened. In the middle of this is Saint-Gobain's facility. They emit PFAS-containing pollutants from the air, gets into the atmosphere, rains down on the soil, and makes its way down into the groundwater. They also have a significant groundwater plume beneath the facility. And there's also runoff associated with a landfill that they use to dispose of some of their waste, in addition to some other places. So surface water has also been impacted in this area. So this is a complicated conceptual model, and actually makes it very challenging to understand the distribution of contaminants because they don't tend to follow the recognized pathways that we generally have in a classic hydrogeologic system. We know a lot now and have come to know a little bit more about the health effects of exposure to very low levels of PFAS. Particularly, we know that the source of groundwater contamination or drinking water is what causes these chemicals to build up mostly in people's bodies. A few years ago, the C8 Science Panel studied about 70,000 people in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and found that relating to a case against DuPont, found probable links between PFOA exposure and testicular and kidney cancer, among 4 other outcomes. And other studies in the recent years have shown possible associations between PFOA exposure and immune system impacts, decreased fertility, low birth weight, reduced vaccine efficacy, et cetera. So this is an ongoing unfolding of the public health impacts associated with very low level exposure to PFOA. Oops. This is very sensitive, sorry. So in 2018, the state of New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services issued a report in which they looked at the public health impacts in the area of Merrimack. They tested 217 people, the blood levels of PFOA, and 217 random people in the Merrimack area. The population of Merrimack's about 25,000 people. And they found about twice the national average, the NHANES average, around that same time frame of PFOA in people's blood, as you can see from this graph. Interesting to note that the US population in 2005 to 2006 is also provided on this graph. And industry was supposedly phasing out the use of these chemicals over the past, since I think about 2006. There's been about 2 half-lives of in those 6 years. So you can see how phasing out of the industry use of these chemicals has resulted in a lower average serum level of PFOA in the blood in the United States. Also to note is a separate sample in southern New Hampshire of about 3,000 people who were exposed to contaminated drinking water associated at the Haven well, and that resulted in elevated levels of serum PFOA as well. Here we go. In 2008, the state issued this incidence report stating when they compared the levels of cancer to the state averages, they didn't find any significant difference from the state average. However, this did not satisfy the residents of the area. They had some concerns about how the comparison was done, and we felt some of those concerns were valid. So they as well, the community took on an assessment, a door-to-door survey of the level of cancer and chronic disease in that community. And that was published in Environmental Health, this peer-reviewed scientific journal, and they had found elevated levels of autoimmune, kidney, cardiovascular, respiratory impacts, liver, and reproductive disorders in the Merrimack people. We started to look at this. This is a US Census Bureau map of population from 2010 in the state of New Hampshire. And then the orange circle indicates the approximate 5-town area that we think has been impacted by the result of emissions from the Saint-Gobain facility. And as you can see, the study area is a heavily densely populated area of the state of New Hampshire. It's actually about 10% of the population in the state of New Hampshire. And if you add in the other area, which I've referenced on the previous slide, which is another area where people are impacted by contaminated drinking water, it's really about 12 to 15% of the population of the state of New Hampshire. And when you combine that with the distribution of cancer overall in the state of New Hampshire, you can see on this map that southeastern New Hampshire really has highest rates of cancer in the state, combined with really the highest population density. So when you compare the rates of cancer within the study area to the state, most of the cancer incidence has probably been driven by this area of the southeastern New Hampshire. So when you compare these on top of the fact that New Hampshire also has the highest rates of cancer in the nation for pediatric cancer, bladder cancer, esophageal cancer, and breast cancer, and some of the highest rates of other cancers, we were concerned that this maybe wasn't a valid comparison as well. So we set out to compare the cancer rates in New Hampshire to national levels. You can see here we did a relative risk analysis for Merrimack versus the National Cancer Institute cancer incidence numbers. If you're not used to looking at these kinds of diagrams, here you'll see the red triangle is pointing to the number 1 with the blue line. Anything to the right of the blue line, the diamond is the relative risk ratio, and then the black bars are the confidence, the 95% confidence limits. If the diamond lies to the right of number 1, it indicates it's an increased risk to the Merrimack people. If the entire bracketed area lies to the right, it's also statistically significant. So you can see here when we compared the rates of cancer in Merrimack, there are 24 cancer sites. When we compare those to the national limit levels of incidence during the same time frame, which was 2005 to 2014, we see that mesothelioma, esophageal, thyroid, and bladder cancer are statistically significantly different than the national averages. And then kidney and renal, brain and central nervous system, leukemia, larynx, colon, and melanoma rates are elevated above the national levels. So we decided to take this a step further, and we looked for comparator towns. And we identified 5 comparator towns across the New England area that were demographically similar to Merrimack. These include 3 towns in Maine, which are South Portland, Auburn, and Sanford. You can see these are fairly demographically similar to Merrimack. We also found Colchester, Vermont to be similar and decided to pick that for a comparator. And we also looked at the levels of maybe possible exposure to the people in these towns to PFOA. You can see here that Merrimack, one of the highest municipal wells, was 140 parts per trillion of PFOA when it was taken offline in 2016. But the other towns, Colchester and the 3 main towns, we really didn't see any evidence of there being a contaminated water supply. However, we know that Bennington, Vermont, where Saint-Gobain moved from in 2002, contaminated the water supply in that area. See the range of PFOA in this area. So we also decided to compare the rates to see what they were, if they were similar or dissimilar between Merrimack and Bennington, Vermont. And these are fairly similar towns also demographically to Merrimack, so we felt that was a valid comparison. This chart shows you the results of our comparison. Each column is a different comparator town. So you can see in the first column is Merrimack versus the National Cancer Institute, national averages or cancer incidences for the same time period. To the right is Sanford, Auburn, and South Portland, and then Colchester and Bennington. As you go down the column, you'll see decreasing average, the relative risk goes down as you go down the column. So at the top was mesothelioma, for instance, in the national, when you compared Merrimack to the National Cancer Institute cancer incidence numbers. So I'm going to go through these a little bit one at a time. So we can see right at the top here, like mesothelioma is statistically significantly different from the national cancer rates. And then when you compare it to the other towns in Maine, we see that it's elevated above South Portland and Auburn. We don't have any data from mesothelioma yet from Vermont. And when we look at esophageal cancer, again, it's statistically significantly higher than the national average, elevated above the Sanford and Auburn, Maine comparators, not above the South Portland, and we don't have data for Vermont for esophageal cancer. Thyroid cancer actually is interesting in that it's statistically significantly above the national levels, but also above the Sanford and South Portland. It's elevated above Auburn. We didn't get any data from the state of Vermont, but we decided to look closer at this. We took some county level thyroid cancer data. You can see this bar chart. To the left of the triangle, those are the Maine and Colchester, Vermont comparator towns. You can see they're all lower than the one with the red triangle, which is the county that includes 4 of the impacted towns in our study area. One of the other towns is located in Rockingham County to the right. And then you can see the Bennington, Vermont thyroid cancer rate for that county to the right, which is the highest, which is interesting. So it's kind of showing a comparison, a similarity to the Merrimack area.
Cindy, 3 minutes.
Cancer. Thank you. Bladder cancer rates are elevated above the national levels in and also in Colchester, Vermont, not different from Bennington, Vermont, which is interesting. And we think that the bladder cancer numbers are probably related to arsenic contamination naturally in groundwater. Moving on to kidney and renal cancer, you can see repetition again in the Maine towns, but not in Vermont. We don't have data yet for Vermont. Colon cancer actually was another interesting, we know ulcerative colitis is connected with exposure to PFOA, and we're seeing a higher elevated level of colon cancer in this area, including in Colchester, Vermont. But we're seeing very similar rates in the Bennington area when you compare to Merrimack. Prostate cancer is elevated in when you compare Merrimack to some of these Maine towns, as well as the Colchester, Vermont, but similar to Bennington again. So we, again, we think it's compelling that there's a similarity between Merrimack, the cancer levels in Merrimack, and the Bennington, Vermont area. Another place where PFOA exposure has known to occur, especially when we look at thyroid, prostate, and colon cancers. And the fact that cancers, the risk of cancer is known or thought to be connected with PFOA exposure, like thyroid, kidney, prostate, and colon cancer, appear to be higher in Merrimack than the non-PFOA contaminated towns in Maine and Vermont. So we conclude that comparing incidence rates in exposed community to a state where incidence rates are elevated may not adequately respond to concerns of the communities when a relatively high proportion of the cancer is derived from a population that's higher already in the same area. They reside in that same area. So we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Good timing. We have 1 minute left. So if we have questions, we can take at least one.
Don't see any yet. How does this control for history of exposure?
So when I looked at the demographics, there isn't a lot of data on, I think what you're talking about is how long people have lived in the area and how long they've been exposed to it. We couldn't really control for that necessarily, though the demographic information was pretty similar when we compared the living in the same house for a year ago type of numbers. But we know that exposure needs to happen probably a much longer period of time. So I think we couldn't control for that, but when you compare the rates to Bennington, it was striking that they were pretty similar to Bennington, Vermont. And as I said, that industry had left Bennington in 2002, came to New Hampshire. So while the people of Merrimack may not have been exposed the exact same length of time as the people in Bennington, it was striking how the similarity between the rates, how we saw the similarity between the rates between the two towns.